First, thank you for making time for this interview. I'm getting your lunchtime.
No, of course.
So there's been a lot of energy policy pronouncements in the Philippines in the past year. If you've been, I'm sure you've been following it. There's been a lot of pronouncements about coal, LNG, RE, and even nuclear. I was interested, as a first question, is there something in particular about the Philippines that you are watching specifically?
There are certain specific things. I think in general, I'm watching to see what direction the Philippines is going to take. We have policy targets. We have the Philippines Energy Plan that has ambitious renewable energy deployment targets. And we see, Bloomberg saying that it is the second most attractive renewable energy market in the entire world. But at the same time, we still have major coal coming online, major enthusiasm for natural gas, and seeing a lot of delays for renewable energy. So there are certain policy areas. That the gas development bill was important. The clarification of the coal moratorium was important. I'm always watching the results of the green energy auction program. But in general, it's more this holistic sense of what's going to happen next that I think is really interesting in the Philippines.
What is this? Do you see confusion, lack of clarity in terms of policy direction?
I think there is. I think there is a lack of clarity about how the policy mechanisms for renewable energy are going to be enforced and how they're going to be clarified. Over the past several years, we've seen several advancements in renewable energy policy, right? Opening up the space to foreign investment, holding these large centralized green energy auction programs. But there's still barriers with the grid. There's still issues in allowing these renewable projects to connect and deploy. And so at the same time as you have those policy clarifications for renewables, you still have the gas and coal movement that's very strong.
And this lack of clarity cannot be a good thing, right?
I don't think it is. I think the fact that there are mechanisms in place is an amazing thing. I think that's what Bloomberg sees when it ranks it so highly. But certainly I think there's more to be done, and it's a really exciting space to be in, certainly.
You see an opportunity.
Absolutely.
Instead of a challenge.
The opportunity is clearly massive, right? The Philippines has huge renewable energy potential, and it feels like it's at the cusp of a breakthrough. And it's a matter of when that breakthrough is going to happen, not if it's going to happen. And so that's what I'm most excited about.
However, we see a lot of push for LNG, and you did a study on LNG. Prospects in Asia. Can you tell us more about it and what aspects of that study can be applied to the Philippines?
Yeah. So I'll start with just at a global level and then move down to the Philippines. Globally, there is a massive amount of new LNG supply coming online. This is based on projects already under construction in places like the United States, Qatar, Russia, Canada, elsewhere. At the same time, a lot of the major markets, I'm talking about Europe, Japan, South Korea, are clearly shifting away from LNG, right? So that means that the LNG supply industry is going to have to find new markets to sell its product in. And where it's looking is South and Southeast Asia. According to Shell, these are going to be the largest growth markets for LNG in the entire world. Right? So there's a real push on behalf of the industry to develop this value chain for LNG, and that's why it's impacting the Philippines so massively. Is we see this huge pipeline of new gas-fired power plants that are being proposed. Now, the progress that the LNG industry is making is also quite slow, and there's a major discrepancy between what the Philippines can actually build, what it can actually afford, and what the industry is expecting. So that's what my studies have been about, the differing expectations between investors and some of the market realities on the ground. I think there's a lot of doubt and skepticism about the country's ability to pay for this higher cost fuel.
There's an ambition to make the Philippines like the LNG hub of Asia. There's that thought. If you're saying it takes a long time to roll out all of these projects, is it because of the cost? Is it because of the length of the time it takes to build these facilities?
Yeah, it's both. The Philippines has been trying, just for context, the Philippines has been trying to build an LNG facility for much of the last 2 decades, if not more, right? And it was to no avail. And a lot of the early developers said, and I can quote, LNG was simply not competitive in the Philippines' private liberalized market. When you have other sources of competition like coal, like renewables, like Malampaya gas, it became very difficult for LNG to compete. Why are the costs so high for LNG is because you have to produce it in, say, the United States. You then have to freeze it in very expensive facilities, put it on a ship, and ship it halfway around the world. And all of those steps in the supply chain add cost and they add complexity. So that's why we see these higher costs. Now, what am I talking about in terms of numbers? For a lot of markets in Asia, LNG can be 3 to 5 times more expensive than coal, right? So that's why we see this kind of persistence of coal hanging around in the Philippines mix. It's also hanging around in other countries in ASEAN because there's a skepticism about LNG's ability to compete on price.
So you're saying LNG does not make sense?
Certainly from an economic perspective, LNG is one of the most expensive fossil fuels that you can buy. It does not make sense. And I think policymakers are starting to see the writing on the wall when it comes to that, right?
Would it be correct to say that because they're losing markets elsewhere, the region is becoming a dumping ground for LNG that is not wanted elsewhere?
Absolutely, yeah. I think dumping ground is one way to put it. I kind of frame it as the last bastion of hope for the LNG industry, which is looking to survive in a world that's increasingly moving towards net zero, where the role of fossil fuels globally is shrinking. This is a last-ditch effort.
Of course, the movers in favor of renewable energy precisely doesn't want LNG to be the transition fuel. They want the transition to be straight from coal to renewable energy, but that doesn't appear to be what the government is poised to do. So I think there's really some perception, a lot of perception in fact, that renewable energy is not reliable, and therefore if we want cleaner fuel, we go with LNG. So how do we debunk this?
Yeah, I think just to pick apart your question, the perception is really what's important, because the economic realities tell a very different story. And LNG being simply more expensive, right? Now, how do you debunk this? I've tried to approach this by looking at what other countries are doing, namely China. China is a good example because it's the largest coal-consuming market. It has abundant supplies of other resources. And what we've seen in China is that gas is simply not a bridge transition fuel. Gas has remained at just 3% of the country's power mix for the last decade. It's remained flat at this tiny share. Meanwhile, renewables have quadrupled their market share, and coal is falling. So to say that gas or LNG is contributing to this transition simply strikes me as false based on the data. We could look at India as well, which is relying on coal and renewables rather than LNG for power generation. So based on these other examples, it's clear that LNG is not providing the kind of bridge fuel that the industry is saying that it will provide. Yeah.
So I think help us make it make sense. If it does not make sense to push for LNG, why are governments pushing for LNG?
The industry narrative, I think, is a large reason for why this is happening, right? The LNG industry has framed itself very well, very successfully, as a bridge fuel, meaning it's sustainable, meaning it's affordable, and it's reliable. Now, I would pick apart every single one of those arguments, but that is what policymakers are arguing.
That's what they need to understand.
Yeah, they need to, I think.
It's just a perception.
Exactly.
And in your analysis, the Philippines should go from coal to renewable energy.
I think that's the greatest opportunity, is to leapfrog directly to renewable energy. The Philippines has a legal system in place that prioritizes procuring power in the least cost manner. And that's a real benefit of the Philippines market that not a lot of other countries have. And it should encourage the transition to cheaper forms of energy like renewables.
But it's one thing to say that LNG is not reliable. In fact, you said it's very volatile in terms of prices. But it's another thing to say whether or not renewable energy is reliable in the Philippines, because that's also another perception that it is not.
Yeah. I think there's a couple ways to look at this question. The first one is it implies that fossil fuels have been reliable in the Philippines, which they haven't. Study after study have shown that the annual brownouts that occur in the Philippines electricity system are due to lower operations at key fossil fuels facilities like gas, like coal plants, right? Those are the main culprit behind some of the brownouts that are happening. The other approach to that question is renewables provide only 3%. I'm talking about wind and solar provide just 3% of the Philippines' power mix, right? The global average is 13%. And the IEA is saying that countries can achieve up to 20% with only minor grid changes. So we're far behind, and this idea that adding more is going to make the system more unreliable does not fit in with what the technical consensus tells us, which is that there is significant capacity room for growth in terms of renewable energy before the grid experiences any kind of reliability issues. If I could just add one more point there, is to say that LNG has to be shipped from halfway around the world, and a lot of the infrastructure to ship it can't operate in difficult weather conditions. We did a study that found that some of these import terminals in the Philippines can't operate in moderate breezes. And
that should be a concern given the typhoons.
Given the frequency of typhoons in the Philippines, that's already causing problems in places like Bangladesh. This is not a reliable source of energy.
The other thing that's happening in the Philippines, there's a law that pushes natural gas, indigenous natural gas. Is that an argument in favor of natural gas?
I think that speaks to the competitive environment that LNG is facing, right? I think policymakers are seeing that importing LNG from the United States or Qatar is very expensive. So they're looking for domestic energy resources. The Philippines is not alone in looking for other sources of gas, right? Thailand, Vietnam, you could go throughout the region and give examples of this. So, I don't have any comments really on the bill itself, but I think a lot of the rhetoric around the bill about procuring gas in a cost-efficient and reliable way was simply false. And I think it remains to be seen what impact the bill is going to have on investment in the Philippines.
It's still more expensive than developing RE.
Absolutely. Domestic gas and LNG are both more expensive than coal power and more expensive than renewable power.
So it really has, if you're going to make it cheaper from coal, it will have to be renewable energy.
Absolutely.
When you're looking at RE, what's the critical investment that has to happen to make this possible for us to increase 3% to 12 or to 20%?
Yeah. So we've seen some opening up of the sector recently, right? I mentioned the opening up foreign ownership, easing foreign ownership restrictions, opening up the auction program. These type of mechanisms designed to increase investment flows, open up new investment channels, and increase capacity is step one, right? And I think even with the existing grid, there is more capacity room for growth. Step two is improving the grid in parallel, right? As capacity is growing for renewable energy, there's an opportunity to expand the grid even further. And so that's necessary as a step two. There are other mechanisms, I think, that are important, and that is to give consumers more of a right to choose which power sources they buy from, right? If you have these large distribution companies like Meralco, which are relying on the expensive fuel sources like LNG, coal, consumers have to have a choice to switch to cheaper, more affordable sources. And so opening up those pathways for consumer choice is very important. And I'm speaking mainly about the retail competition and open access rules that the Philippines have. That ARCOA is so critical to increasing the leverage that consumers have in the system.
Especially the young population now are really very concerned about climate change. There's
Absolutely.
an opportunity there.
Yeah.
I think there's one critical discussion about renewable energy is storage, that there's not enough storage. What is happening elsewhere in the world? What's best practice on renewable energy?
Globally, battery storage costs are falling faster than any other asset class. And so while I think storage can add costs to solar and wind, what is that going to look like in 5 years' time? Goldman Sachs expects global battery prices to fall by 50% through 2026, over the next 2 years, right? So we could see a very different environment for batteries. Now, in the meantime, there's room for wind and solar to grow in the Philippines. The battery market in the Philippines is already one of the most robust in Southeast Asia, right? We're using batteries. San Miguel has been a major proponent of deploying batteries, mainly for auxiliary power, backup support to the grid, and not yet quite for power generation itself. But I think there's still room to grow, and I think costs are going to fall, and the Philippines is well positioned to take advantage of that.
And maybe my final question is about nuclear. Right? I've been looking at proposals for nuclear energy for probably a decade, and this has been dismissed as, like a sideshow. But there seems to be a stronger push now, and investors coming in saying you cannot have a transition without nuclear energy.
Yeah. I think, again, there are major flaws in that argument, just based on the numbers alone. I think where this is coming from is the Philippines' affiliation or preference for baseload capacity. When it's looking for LNG and coal and nuclear, it's looking for large sources of baseload. So that's I think where this nuclear push is coming from. The Philippines Energy Plan says that they're going to have, I think it was 1,200 megawatts online by 2032. That's a 7-year timeline from where we are today. The average development timeline for nuclear globally is 11, 12 years, right?
Which does not make sense, right?
Costs balloon over that time, right? More so than any other asset class. Nuclear is prone to massive cost overruns. And the Philippines has a really checkered history with nuclear, trying to develop the Bataan nuclear plant as far back as the 70s. So, there's a number of proposals in play. Reviving the Bataan plant is one. Bringing in small modular reactors is another. And I think in terms of small modular reactors, there are only 2 operating worldwide. This is really a nascent technology. A number of plants have already been canceled in the US. And sure enough, we see those same US developers coming to the Philippines and proposing their same projects. So all of that is to say that nothing is really inspiring confidence about the nuclear industry's ability to bring these facilities online in a timely fashion, but also to do so in an affordable way.
The way you're talking about all of these industries is really profit driven. Is that how simple it is? This all business and decisions are made based on profit?
I think that's a large part of the equation. And I think we're dealing with legacy industries, large corporations in the Philippines and abroad that have a historical bent for these centralized baseload fossil fuel facilities, grid operators that know how to do this. And I think continuation of that business model is key to what's happening. Certainly with LNG, you see all this Japanese investment, and their domestic market for gas is falling. They are looking for expansion and business opportunity growth in places like the Philippines. So, yeah.
But and bottom line, if we're looking for cheaper electricity, cheaper power, it's really RE. There's no debate.
The evidence is clear. The numbers show that renewable energy is pricing in more cheaply and in a less volatile way than fossil fuels. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful.
Yeah.